this computer. All right, hello and welcome back to another Craft of Code workshop. Today we're going to be looking at what I consider the basic Webpack and Babel settings that you need for a simple React app. This is kind of what I use if I'm just going to make a simple app. But I'm going to give a big caveat at the beginning, which is that none of this is, the right way necessarily, or the canonical solution to how to do this. There's a lot of different ways that you can set up React. And in part, I think that can lead to a lot of confusion for us newer developers as we're trying to, figure out how to do this. One website might tell you to do this, another website might tell you to do it this way. So I wanted to show you kind of a foolproof way that you can set up your apps while you're here at Hack Reactor. Something that I did want to go over really quick that's related, but not exactly about Webpack. I think many of you have had this question a lot recently, which is using a CDN to import a library. So I've made this really simple example just to kind of show you how that works. And some of you may have run into a cannot import error or something like that. So usually Webpack is going to take all of your dependencies and put them all into one little package with your code, and that all gets run. Everything kind of lives in this magical, happy bundle, and you never have to worry about have you imported the thing or not. But another way to set stuff up is that you can actually import libraries via the script tag pointing at a CDN, which is basically a copy of the code that's required to run to make that library available. So there's just a copy of that code on some servers. Most packages you can do CDN and the package name, and you'll get a link. So here I have the links to React and React DOM. I'm just going to show you a little bit of how that works. We're going to open this in our browser, default browser. Okay, so there's our HTML content. I'm going to open our tools. Okay, and I'm Colin. So that ran because of this script over here. So just showing you that the scripts that you run basically just run JavaScript in the browser. Then over here, because we've run React, notice that now I can say React here, and it actually has something. So React DOM. So those objects, those libraries exist because of these script tags, and anything that I were to do here would allow me to then reference those items, right? So if I were to write React here, it would actually print out React. Or if I were to, in the script tag, create a React, use React DOM, that would work because we have access to those variables in the browser. So hopefully that little demo helps illustrate a little bit about how that works. And we'll go back over to our VS Code. Okay, so let's get started. It can be super intimidating to start when all you've got is basically a blank folder. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to initiate your package with npm. So we're going to do npm init. This is going to ask you a bunch of questions. Kind of the top level take home for this is that right now, as a student, most of this information doesn't matter. So we give it a package name, version, doesn't really matter. Don't have to give it a description, so I'm not going to. Entry point. Again, this isn't really going to matter because we're not publishing anything. So I'm just going to leave it as index.js. Test command, we're not going to write any tests. Just going to leave that blank. Git repository. This automatically picked up the Git repository because I started this from a Git repository. Otherwise, you can put that in. But again, you don't have to have this in there. Your code's going to work just fine without it. Keywords, don't need to put those in. Author, don't need to put it in, but I'm going to. License, again, ISC is just fine. Great. So once it's done asking you questions, it's going to give you a little preview of the package.json it's going to build for you. If you feel like that's great, you can just hit yes. And you'll see package.json has opened up. So now we're kind of in a little bit more familiar territory. We've got our package.json. It's a good start. Next thing you want to start thinking about is probably like your basic folder structure. So for this project, I'm going to have a client folder. This is where I'm going to put my source code. The client name is pretty arbitrary, but in this case, I want to have a folder just for client source code. Maybe you'll see some other repos just name this like source. The idea is you want a folder where your like uncompiled source code is going to live. And then we want another folder, which is going to be public in this case. And this is where our any of the code or any of the other assets that we're going to be serving up on our web page are going to live. Okay, so first we're going to do a little bit of, we're going to kind of deconstruct Babel and Webpack a little bit and understand what each one of them does separately. So for this, I'm setting up this little project, these little sample files. So inside the client folder, we're going to make a new file. We're going to call it example.js. Just going to grab all this code here. Oh, that's handy. They give you a little copy and paste now. Paste this in here. So this just has a little alarm class, and it's going to ring the alarm, which will probably say, wake up, it's 1 p.m., time for basketball. And it's also going to import this other file, which we're going to make. New file, example2.js, and example2.js is just this. So all that does is it exports a string. So let's really quickly, let's just run this node file. We're going to do node client/example.js and see what happens. Great. So it says this is from another file, which is coming from over here. We're console logging the example2 that we're exporting. And then it says, wake up, it's 1 p.m. time for basketball. Excellent. Something I want to point out is that we're using ES6 syntax. So we're using class. We're also using object destructuring. Keep that in your mind for later. Okay, so next we're going to bundle this. Webpack is the tool that we're going to be using to bundle our code. So it's going to take both of our files, put it into one file that you can run, and it should do exactly the same thing as the files when they weren't bundled. So let's add Webpack. And I think this can be a little bit confusing depending on where you're getting your information from, like what exactly you need to install for Webpack. And so I'm trying to distill it as much as possible to the bare minimum. So this command here is going to kind of give us the bare minimum that we need for Webpack. There's some more details about what those packages are that you can read about later. And once we've got Webpack, we need to tell Webpack what to do. So there's some configuration that we need to do. There's, again, there might be a few different options for how to set the configurations. I'm most comfortable with the JavaScript file. So I'm going to make a new file here in our root, and we're going to call that webpack.config.js. Now, here I've got what I kind of consider the bare minimum that you're going to need to get Webpack working. We're importing path just to make it easier to work with paths. Then module.exports, this is going to be the actual settings object. You can look at the documentation for what all the various settings are that you can do. We'll add more to this later. But for now, let's go over the most basic settings that you have to provide. So you need to provide an entry point. So this is going to be where Webpack first, it's the first file the Webpack's going to open. And then any other file that's required in there, it's going to go down that chain and pack up whatever it finds in there. So you've got to point the entry setting to the right file. If I were to point this at example 2, it's not going to work because example 2 doesn't import anything. So we've got to point it at example, which we've done here. Next, output, you've got to tell Webpack where to put whatever it produces, and you got to tell it what it should call whatever it produces. So that's all we're doing here. We're saying start at example, and the output, you're going to put it into public, and you're going to call it bundle.js. So those are our settings. And we're going to want to write a script in package.json to make our lives a little bit easier when we're interacting with it. So we're at scripts. Here we are, adding a script. We're going to call that build. And build is going to do webpack -- mode none. So I'm using this -- mode. It's an option you can pass in, and I've passed in the none option. You will never want to do this. It's basically saying like, don't like pack this up and like don't do anything to it, which is almost never what you're going to want to do. But for explanation purposes, we're going to leave it like this for now. We will change that later. So let's run build. Webpack mode none, and it's build, and we should see a bundle.js in here. So we're going to take a look in here and see what's in here. Okay. So there's a bunch of other kind of cruft that I have no idea what it means, but notice that within here, we basically see the exact same code that we wrote in example. Pretty much line for line, even my comments are in there. So all this has done is taken those two files and put them into one, and we're going to verify that because I'm going to do node. So we're going to run this file, bundle.js. Oops. And we should see the same output that we did before when we ran example. And in fact, that is the case. So there it is. This is from another file, and wake up, it's 1 p.m. time for basketball. So what Webpack has done is it literally just put our two files together into one file that you can execute with the same results. Let's take a look at the chat real quick to do on the TA. Mark, I cannot tell you what you will or won't have to do on the TA, as I do not even know what the TAs are like. So that's probably a better question for Stephen or Trent. Any questions about kind of Webpack and what its main purpose is at the moment? Yes, Sully, yes. Yeah, so because we've given it the entry point of example.js, it is going to hit this first line that's going to say require example 2, then it's going to run example 2. So if we're to do Webpack and give it the entry point example 2 and then pack it up, or look at the bundle, it's only that one file. Where is it? This is, yeah. So we're not going to find alarm in here anymore. All right. Great. Okay, so if we create files after the Webpack build is run, do we just need to run build again, and it will update our bundle. Yes, Austin, that is exactly correct. Now there's also a watch option similar to the Babel watch option, which will automatically look for any changes in your file and rerun. And we'll set that up later. What more questions? Is there a single file exported from a file post bundle? Is there a single file exported, one variable? Sully, will you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sorry, yeah, it's hard for me to put it all down in chat.
All good.
Basically, if you export, say, from a file one file, and that creates the connection for which Webpack then connects the two files into one file. If you reference, I mean, it's probably, I'd imagine, bad practice, but if you have a variable which references another variable within, or has the same reference name to a variable within another file that has the same name, would you have cross-reference problems?
So an example of that would be like if an example, I made a variable called like A and I set it to the value of 1, and then example 2, I had A and set it to a different value, would they interfere with each other?
Correct. Like even if one of them, if it was never exported pre-bundled.
So Webpack, basically, if your files working separately work correctly, and you're not having like scoping issues, then once you Webpack, it's the same. And part of that also has to do with modules. So each module has its own variable space. There's a word for this that's slipping my mind. But I would have to like, the only way that I would get a conflict is if I were to like add that variable to the global scope. And then in the other file, I were to then explicitly also modify that variable on the global scope.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So like, I guess we could also just show you really quick. So if in here, before modules.export, maybe we just did let A equal 1. And then over here, we could do let A equal colon, and then log that. So this is just going to log. Well, I guess we can try logging this before that because theoretically example 2 has been run. I think we're going to end up with an error here because A hasn't happened yet, but basically they're totally encapsulated. Node public bundle. Node public slash, okay, well, I guess it did nothing now. Oh, because I haven't changed the entry point back. Okay. Bundle.js, yeah, and then we got a syntax error that A hasn't been defined because the scope over in each of these files is basically completely independent. Okay, any last questions here before I move on? Excellent. Save this. Okay, so what do we go to next? Well, we notice all this stuff. Now we're going to add Babel. Can anybody tell me what Babel does? Just unmute yourself and chime in. And don't read this.
It turns like ES6 or whatever JavaScript you have into a mostly like broader comprehended version of it so that more browsers can render it.
So yes, that is a even more specific use of Babel. More generally, Babel is a transpiler. And so what you said, Tristan, is right, that it can take ES6 and it can turn it into older versions of JavaScript that are compatible with more browsers. So that is one of the uses, but it's not limited in what it can transpile. So it can also be used to transpile our JSX code in React to JavaScript, which the browser can then execute. Looking in the chat, transpiler, yes, exactly. And the way that Babel knows what it's translating is we have to tell it. So there's some settings for Babel as well. We have to specifically tell it to do the transforming of ES6 syntax to older syntaxes, and we also have to tell it to transpile the JSX into JavaScript for us. So again, this is another place where, depending on the instructions you're following and the place you're looking at, you might get a different list of the different packages you have to install to get Babel working. Again, I've tried to distill this to the minimum you need. So let's put all of this in. And you can come and look at this repo later, a little explanation about what each of those packages does. Also notice that I'm using -- save dev with the install. And what that's doing is it's putting these dependencies into dev dependencies, which is not absolutely essential, but it's considered a good practice. Any packages that you only need in development, to save them as a dev dependency, and any packages your code actually needs to run should be saved as a regular dependency. But do not stress too much about that. Just making you aware. Okay, so we've got all of that installed. It's all in here. So now we've got to, we have to do two things. First, we have to tell Webpack that Webpack should be using Babel, right? Before, when we packaged, all we did was we just packaged the JavaScript together. Now we're going to say, hey, Webpack, before you package it together, you're also going to have to run this through Babel and then package it up. And you can actually do this inside the webpack.config file. You can both specify that it should use Babel, and you can also pass in your settings and preferences for Babel. Another option that you'll see out there is like a babel.rc file, but that's basically doing the same thing here. Okay, so we're going to go edit our webpack.config file, and we want it to look. No, let's see, what are we? We're just adding this. Yeah, okay. So we're going to add all of this code. So we're leaving our entry point and our output. And this is just a JavaScript object, right? So we're going to add more properties to these settings. Okay. So what are we doing here? We're adding a module, and don't grill me too much about exactly how this works, because a lot of it is mostly just referencing the documentation. But you've got to put in this module option, and then you're defining the rules for that module. So test, this is saying, basically telling it what types of files to use these rules for. So anytime it finds something that ends in .js or .jsx, it's going to use these rules. Exclude says do not look at anything in node modules. Then use, this is telling us what rules we're going to be applying. So we're going to be using a loader, which is Babel loader. And the options that we're going to pass it are the presets that we need, that we want to use on our code when we're transpiling. So the first one is Babel preset environment. This is the one that's going to be taking our ES6 code and transpiling it back to something that's more broadly compatible. And then we're also passing it Babel preset React. So we're saying, okay, Webpack, for these types of files, we're going to be using Babel loader. And Babel loader, when you're running, these are the presets that you're going to want to be translating for. So anytime you see ES6 stuff, you're going to translate it. And anytime you see React code, you're going to translate it. And those presets are made for you. You don't need to do anything. You just have to install the packages and put them in here. Okay. So let's run the build again and see what happens. So we're still doing this to our little example files. Okay, it's been filled. Now, if we open our bundle, we should expect to see no more ES6 code in here. And in fact, there's a lot more code because there's a whole bunch of, I guess it's called polyfilling that needs to happen. But notice alarm no longer is defined with class alarm. It's now var alarm. There's probably not a single let in here. Yeah, so we're not going to be defining variables with let anymore. You can see here that before we were using object destructuring, but now it's been turned into something else. So we've bundled this together and we've transpiled it. And at the end of the day, if we do node public/bundle.js, it still does the exact same thing as the code that we wrote before. Okay, so hopefully this really illustrated well what Babel's doing, what Webpack's doing, and showed you some of the basic options. Next, we're going to be tying in React. Any questions before we do that? Okay, great. Through the magic of television, we're going to move over here. There's a bit of just copy and pasting that's got to be done. I don't want to take the time to do. So, I probably have to do npm install. Let's do that. So let's look at our package.json. We fast forwarded a little bit in time. And we've added React and React DOM. I think you're all pretty familiar with those. Notice this got saved with just save instead of save dev, because we actually want to be using React and React DOM in our production code. So what we fast forwarded through is creating this basic React boilerplate. I got rid of the example files, but we now have our index.html file, which just has a div called app and a script that's going to be running our bundle.js. We've got a styles.css in the same public folder, and we are importing that using link relevance style sheet right here. Then we've got in our source code, we've got index.js, which imports React, React DOM, and the app component, and then calls React DOM.render. And we've got our React app, which is a class component, which is just going to take a message, which is check out this bundle.js and render that as an H1. So we've done all of that. Okay, so now we need to update our Webpack configuration, because we were, of course, looking for the example.js folder. I guess I've already done that here. So we've changed that to be client/index.js. Now, why did we choose that file? Because this is where we set off the entire chain of React, right? In here, we're going to be importing app, presumably an app. If we have any other child components, those are going to be imported there. So this is kind of where all the magic starts. That's why we're pointing the entry point to that file. Output, we're leaving it the same. Module is still totally the same. Now we've added 2 more options. Remember before I told you I used mode none? So now we're going to use mode development. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what that does. Setting mode development tells Webpack to prioritize ease of development while building the bundle. makes it easier to debug your code should you need to find a bug. Yeah, so I think that's what that does. And then dev tool, this is about source mapping. And what source mapping is once you've built your bundle, if you need to debug that in Chrome and you pause your code, depending on how you set up the bundle, the code that you're going to be looking at might be completely unrecognizable. If it's a production build that's been minified, the Webpack is going to replace all of your variable names with just like random letters from the alphabet. You will not be able to tell what is going on. But what you can do while you're in development is tell Webpack to create a source map. And the browser is then able to reload this source map. And what it does is it serves as a map saying like, this is the bundled code, but this is the source code. So when you use the debugger, it'll actually take you to your source code and you won't be dealing with the bundle. Does that make sense to folks? Can I maybe get some like B's in the chat if that makes sense, or no's if it doesn't? Cool. Excellent. Yeah. So these are the two options that we've added to our configuration. Okay, and we need to update our npm script because we were passing in the mode none, and we actually don't want to do that. We want to do watch. So Austin, I think you asked about this. This is where you can tell Webpack to watch the files and rebuild anytime a file changes. Start. All right, live server. Server public. I think most of you should have live server installed globally, but if not, you can also, there's instructions in here on installing that. Okay, and notice that we could also just do Webpack. Like we could just write Webpack on our command line. We don't need to supply it, npx Webpack. We don't need to supply it any additional options because we've specified all the options in our webpack.config file. But in the build, we're specifying the watch option because that makes life easier in development. All right. Run build, npm start. Okay, well, clear this. Here we're gonna split up our terminals. We'll add a second terminal. npm run build. So this will now be watching the files. Great, successful. And then over here, we're gonna start live server, npm start. Great. And there it is. Check out this bundle JS. Now, notice live server is serving up this index.html file because no, it's actually serving the whole public directory, but it's serving index.html. Index.html is asking for the style sheet. So the style sheet is getting sent as well. So hopefully that connection makes sense. You'll see some instructions for using, you can use Webpack and Babel to bundle your styles up as well. It's a little bit more complicated. So I usually, for a basic app, I will opt to just put the styles.css file in the public folder and just do all of my styling in there. Great. Okay. Hey, that's it. So any questions?
It You like in the senior phase, are you starting to make your own bundles a lot more for those projects?
Yes. So in the senior phase, you'll have 4 projects, and all of those are going to start from absolutely 0. So you'll get to decide how you set up Webpack, how you're going to use Babel, all of that good stuff. And you might add some more bells and whistles than what this provides. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to point to a couple of resources. Number one is that this repo has a solution branch, or is it called solution? Let's go look at what it's called before I lie to you. A complete branch. So if you want like a bit of a cheat sheet for a Webpack config file, you can look in there. Senior phase, good to know. Create app. Yes, Anton, thank you. I was going to mention that. There's some resources here at the bottom. One of them is Create React App. And I think Joe showed this to us in the junior phase, but this will help you. Something to maybe note is that I believe this is still using Webpack 4. So, and I think mostly it still works with Webpack 5. But just be aware that this doesn't know that Webpack 5 exists, at least last time I checked. But I have not run into any problems as of yet. Yeah, these are some great websites. This walkthrough is like super, it's a bit old. Yeah, I think this one's like very detailed about like every single option that you can add. So worth checking out. Hello, chat. Phase, yes, cool. And we've got a little bit of additional content here, which is some different build scripts. Just make you aware that when you're deploying your code, you might want to change some of the options. So you can make yourself a build production script, and notice that I'm passing in mode production and no dev tool, which overwrites these options. And what that does is it just packs up your file more efficiently, so that it takes up less space, and it doesn't add a source map because you don't want people able to debug your web page and see your source code. So you can look in here for a couple suggestions on that. Excellent. So I think with that, I will conclude this episode of The Craft of Code. Thank you very much for attending.